Hello, everyone. Welcome to the April 26, 2023 meeting of Sig-Auth. Let's kick it off. We have quite a bit on the agenda. Maybe just to kick it off, first announcement is if you missed the KubeCon Sig-Auth deep dive, here's the schedule along with the slides, and the recording should be up in, I think, next week. And Jordan, you want to talk about the other topics?
Yeah, for those who were at KubeCon, it was great to see everybody. We had several good discussions, kind of working out some long-standing questions about designs and things. We tried to take good notes for the people who weren't at KubeCon. I've missed plenty of KubeCons and wished that I knew what people talked about. So we tried to at least take notes and leave breadcrumbs, and for our own memory and for the benefit of people who kind of wondered, what topics did we talk about? A lot of those conversations are going to, thanks, David. A lot of those conversations are going to trickle into updates in the KEP designs, pull requests and things in the next few days, hopefully this week, next week. So look for that, but I did want to point people to the some of the notes we took. That segues into the next couple of bullet points. So we're starting to spin up work for 128 and kind of got a clearer picture of which things are ready to proceed with implementation, which things seem achievable to get a design pinned down and actually get an initial implementation in 128. And then a couple things that are probably going to stick in the design phase for 128. So those are links to queries into the enhancements repo. Take a look at those. We tried to actually assign things to the people who said they would be working on stuff, who we think will be working on stuff. So look at what's assigned to you, make sure it matches what you're planning to work on. And I didn't have a lot else to say. It was mostly just kind of an announcement to go look at those things, make sure it matches your expectations. If it doesn't, like, jump in Slack or something, we'll figure out who to add or who to remove or what to pull in or what to push out, but wanted to make sure everyone was on the same page. And then the last item was just linking to a couple of things that Sig API machinery is really driving, but are of interest to Sig-Auth. So some of the continuing improvements to admission stuff that is probably interesting to people here.
Hey, a quick question. I think this is new, right? I don't think we talked about it.
Micah and Mo and I spent some time talking about it and kind of had some ideas, which I think got included in the notes on April 19th. So Micah and Mo and Igor were going to try to take some of that feedback and update the design. So I don't think we're ready to wrap this up and have it be implementable yet, but they had some next steps to kind of continue pushing on the design.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Thanks. All right. I guess with that, let's talk about user namespaces support.
So hi, I'm Rodrigo. So we added in Sig-Node, we added support for user namespaces as an alpha feature. But we wanted to check with you folks here how it should interact with pod security policies. During KubeCon, I chatted a little bit with Mo about it, but it seemed best anyway to come here to the meeting and make this topic available for everyone. Basically, what we are doing now is like we're adding a new namespace that is the user namespace. So current spot until now use the host user namespace, and yeah, the restricted policy disallows host namespaces. So we're trying to think how we should interact with pod security standards. Like what we talked with Mo was basically at some release, probably when the feature is still alpha, we should add it. We should disallow the host user namespace in the restricted policy for, I don't know, Kubernetes, whatever version, and then go from there.
So I think other things to add there is we would also want some fields like capabilities to be expanded. So when we are in a user namespace, it's actually safer to give more capabilities to the pod. You can be running as root because you're not really root on the host and so on. So it's like when we are in a user namespace, some of the other fields get relaxed. And that's what we want to be able to express.
So just to for my own memory, like a default pod, like if I just create a pod and I don't specify anything, by default it uses the host namespace. Is that correct?
The host user
The
namespace. Yep.
Host user namespace. Okay. So the baseline level would continue to allow a default pod. So the guidance for the baseline level is that we don't allow sort of escalating things or putting things into a pod spec that escalate permissions beyond just the defaults. So you can't say privilege true. You can't say like add a host mount volume. You can't say host networking true. But because host user namespace has been the default, that will continue to be allowed in the baseline level.
I think that's fair. So
Okay.
What if someone enables a user namespace? Now can we say that they can be root, they can add more capabilities because these fields are actually tied to the user namespace?
That sounds like it would be safe if the kubelets supported it as well.
Supported what?
So the QAPI server doesn't have knowledge of whether the kubelet will honor the values set in the pod, right? So
Right.
for instance, you introduce this feature in 127, kubelets in 127 know about it, but the QAPI server could not relax its validation until 130 at this point, right? Because of the n-3.
Well, it's actually more tricky because to use a user namespace, we don't only need changes in Kubernetes, we also need support in container runtimes, the Linux kernel, and the file systems used by the pod. So even in 130, you cannot know for sure if that will be honored.
I guess, Rodrigo, we can assume that, okay, the node level stuff is taken care of, and then we just worry about the kubelet and the API interaction here.
Okay.
But it
Yeah,
does seem to me
yeah,
that
it makes sense.
It would make a pod that wanted to turn on those capabilities. Like, as I understand the way user namespaces work, we would be able to let a pod that was using user namespaces run as root. And the point is that that would be allowable in a restricted policy, because you would not be able to escape from your container and impact things on other containers.
Yeah, so there's two directions. One is relaxing restrictions on things like run as user for pods that say user namespace true. And like David said, we would only want to do that once we were sure that the user namespace true thing expressed in the API was actually effective all the way down to the node and the runtime. So like the prereqs for that are the field hits GA, so we're sure that it, like, the feature is locked on. You can't have a component that is saying, actually, I don't pay attention to that feature. And the oldest node that we would support in SKU with the control plane is either going to honor the user namespace flag or reject the pod if it turned off the feature. I'm not sure how it was implemented on the node side. And I guess you were saying there's also container runtime stuff. So do we have positive detection on the node side to know that the container runtime supports user namespaces, or does it just sort of tell the container runtime, run this thing with user namespaces, and if the container runtime doesn't support it, it's like, oh, well, you got host namespaces. Do we have positive detection there?
Go ahead, Rodrigo.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so basically the short answer is no. There's a longer answer that is we'll probably backport the change to container runtime, so it will probably honor even on old container runtimes. But yeah, like the change is a backward compatible change. So if you set this field in the CRI API, that is a gRPC API, and the other party doesn't know about that field, then it's ignored.
So that's backwards compatible in that it lets the pod run successfully. But what we actually care about before we relax policy is that it fails safe by not running the container if the user namespace restriction wasn't honored.
So,
Yeah.
so if kubelet and the runtime are using a compatible gRPC API, then ideally the container runtime should fail if it cannot honor the flag passed through the CRI.
So yeah, some details about like how we know that's the case, and like in what version did that logic get put in place. That would help us know when we can relax the run as user restrictions based on the presence of the username.
Yeah. So for container list, container 1.7. For cryo, I think it's cryo 125.
Okay. Yeah, like those
and
details
maybe
would be helpful to add into ideally into the KEP, and maybe have a section in the KEP talking about relaxing the baseline and restricted pod security standards.
Okay, but maybe to have an agreement, maybe on the simpler things first, or maybe these are simpler to resolve. But so at some point, the restricted policy should disallow not setting the user using the host user namespace, right? Or that is not what we want for the restricted policy.
We are able to add new requirements to the restricted policy. I'm not sure if we would say we would disallow setting host, or if we would require setting user namespace true. I can't remember the field name.
Yeah, but those are synonyms, right? If you disallow using the host user namespace, you're mandating that you should use a user namespace in the pod.
Yeah, if I recall correctly, you are only allowed to set user namespace for stateless pods, which don't have volume mounts. It seems really strange to me that we would require pods to use user namespaces, like as a security measure, when they could just say, actually, I mount a persistent volume in, and then we would no longer require them to use user namespaces. That seems pretty strange.
Right. Okay, so yeah, okay, so that is another thing. Like we'll add support for stateful pods, probably soon. But what I don't understand from your comment is, do you want us to wait until we support stateful pods to add pod security integration with pod security standards, or shall we do something before we support all kind of pods?
So there's two directions that we integrate. One is relaxing things like the run as user for pods which are using user namespaces. I don't think we have to wait for stateful support. We just have to wait to make sure nodes are actually honoring the user namespace restriction. The other direction is we require user namespace in the restricted policy. And David has a hand, he can go, but to me, that seems weird to require changes there when someone could just reshape their pod and not be required to use user namespaces.
Okay, makes sense. Yeah, sorry, David, go ahead.
Yeah, so I would really like to find a way to adjust pod security admissions so that if I want to opt in, I know that all my nodes are going to honor this because I own my deployment. I would like to find a way to enable pod security admission to relax the requirement in advance. I think that's useful both because it allows refinement in my cluster. Things that are safe in my cluster are actually safe. I know this, so I can turn it on. And it allows us to get pre-GA signal on both the capability, does it run well, is it efficient, and the user, the felt user impact. I am now able to change my namespace from either baseline or privileged down to restricted with this new feature. I would like to have the ability to do that, and without a way to signal that to pod security admission, I don't know how I would get that same signal.
And how was that handled for other features like SecComp, for example, that are similar in that we need the container runtime to really implement it? And
all the others
like,
were present before, except for the
all the others, what?
OS. All the others predated pod security admission.
Okay.
Right? So you are the lucky first feature.
Well, the Windows support intersected with pod security admission, and we actually waited until the oldest node had support or would fail safe with the pod OS field before we relaxed pod security admission.
So doing it that way, certainly safe. It prevents the ability to assess the felt user impact, and I'll say that I think, I guess neither of these is super common, right? But I think user namespaces is broader than Windows OS. The tricky part is it can't just be a feature flag, I don't think. I mean, I guess it could be.
Yeah, I don't love the meaning of a given version of pod security standards not being consistent across clusters. That's
I'm certainly open to a second signal, right? But I do think we need to have a way to gain feedback. Like, does this interact well? Does it intersect properly? Maybe that's a secondary configuration option. And none of what I'm saying is like, hey, we should change the default. What I'm saying is, if we're going to opt into this and turn it on in a cluster, and like the chances that Renal is going to come to me and say, David, we should turn this on in a tech preview cluster, it seems very high. I'd like to be able to have a full story.
I could maybe see an alpha level thing so that like it sets expectations appropriately. Like, this is a preview thing. This is not a thing that you're expected to enable and then upgrade. And like, it's a try it out thing. Maybe. I don't know. I'd have to think.
I mean, I'm open to that. So I don't think I would want it based. Well, I mean, looking at it, I don't think I'd want it based on the feature gate. Like, there's one argument that says, okay, when you turn on this feature gate, this is what you get. The issue is that because we can have skewed kubelets, an old kubelet wouldn't honor that feature gate, right? So there would be no way to turn that on. I wouldn't want to break somebody else's cluster. So a second opt-in would work for me.
You could have a specific feature gate that just controls relax pod security for this thing.
That would work.
Starts as alpha, dies as alpha.
No, well, based on the, yeah, sure. Because it would never be on by default.
Right.
I think that would satisfy the need, and it would let us get the code that we need in and try it.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you can see you end up in a state where like, okay, you got 3 releases to get to the kubelet bit, and then now you have to have several releases in the API server to get stability. And
yeah, anything that's talking about pod security, admission behavior is scoped to the control plane. So a thing specifically tied to that, I think, makes sense. As far as a KEP update, I think probably a section in the user namespace is KEP, talking about how this interacts with the pod security stuff is good. I think that's what we did for the pod OS KEP.
Okay, but sorry, I'm kind of lost. I'm not sure I follow. So the idea was the idea that seems to fly is to have 2 feature gates, right? Or how is it? Can someone?
Maybe I can try to summarize what I got out of it, and David, Jordan, correct me. So we'll go and update the KEP for user namespaces and describe how we would want things relaxed. And on the site, to start getting feedback on whether a restricted policy can require this, we have a separate flag, which will stay alpha in order to test it out early and not having to wait till it's available on all the nodes. And is this second change also a part of this KEP, or that's a different KEP?
Yeah, it will be a part of your KEP to describe it locally there.
Yep.
Okay. Right, but then the feature gate to relax the checks for the rest of the pod spec when user namespaces are in use will be a feature gate for which component? For the kubelet and the API server?
API server. Pod security only lives in the API server.
But then, but David wanted some guarantee that if we enable this feature, the kubelet will honor it, right? So,
right.
No, I'm
would
happy leaving that.
So,
I'm
sorry.
happy to leave that coordination to the vendor or deployer or whoever's managing it. If they come in and say, okay, control plane, now use user namespaces in pod security admission, they better be sure that all their kubelets support it.
Okay. So we can be super clear in the documentation about it. Like if you use this other feature, the burden is on you to know that your nodes support it.
Yeah, if you opt in early, it's on you to know that.
Okay.
Before we relax by default, I think we would need to have some guarantees in place, like the oldest supported node understands the feature or fail safe and has a way to verify that the container runtime will honor the thing.
Okay. So can I repeat just in case I'm just to see if I understood or if I'm missing something? So we have 2 lines. One is to feature gate. One is to relax the check when user namespaces are in use. So we allow things like running as root. This will be a feature gate on the API server, and the burden to verify that the kubelet will honor it will be on the cluster admin. And then we'll have another feature gate when user namespaces are GA for the restricted policy to enforce user namespaces. And for that, the feature will need to be GA and support, of course, all the pods, not only stateless pods. Did I get it correctly?
I do not think I see a need to support all pods for enabling this feature.
Yeah,
I should be able to recognize the pods for which this applies.
But I mean, like like support all the pods when we want to enforce user namespaces in the restricted policy, because Jordan was saying that otherwise you can just add a volume and circumvent the.
Yeah, so relaxing for user namespace pods is fine once we can do it safe for people opt in. Requiring user namespace pods, I don't think makes sense until we can just require it for all pods, stateful or non-stateful.
Right, and the field should be GA, beta, alpha to require.
It has to
whenever
be
it
GA to
supports
require
everything.
it. You can't
GA,
require
okay,
setting a field that's not GA. So
okay, makes sense. Okay, so I think that's sum it up. So for restricted, we'll wait to change the restricted policy to require username spaces. We'll wait until the field is GA, supports all the pods. To relax the checks for when username spaces are in use, we'll use a different feature gate, and the burden to verify that the kubelet will honor it will be on the cluster admin. Is this a good summary, or am I missing something important here?
I think that makes sense. I tried to update the notes as well. So hopefully that.
Okay, I was going to do that. Thanks.
Yep.
I think I followed all that. I think I'd like to see it written down in the KEP and reserve the right to like add a comment of I forgot this.
Yeah, of course.
But in broad strokes, yes, that's what I'm thinking. And I think that gives you a way to phase this in, get the feedback you need, offer a carrot to a user who does the thing that you want to. I'm maybe less sure about eventually requiring the field to be set.
I'm also less sure about it. I know I wouldn't do it before
Hmm.
it was GA, and I really don't think we should do it before we support.
Yeah, I mean, we have time, and I think we're also planning the stateful support. So hopefully, like by the end of the year, we'll have some clarity on.
But like, hopefully, that gives you like a level set. Like, I want to consider that last bit separately, and the answer to that may be a separate no. And here's the requirements to get there, or no, this just isn't the right choice. Offer a carrot, not a stick.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, we can revisit it.
Yeah, we can mention in the KEP that this is the rough high level idea, and before migrating to GA, we'll clarify with Sig-Auth or whatever.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, automatic reloading of Kate's CA cert in Kate's client libraries. You
yeah,
want to,
look at this.
do you have
I'm not-
anything to share? Or you want to talk through it?
I'm not sure if Sig-Auth is here, but can you guys hear me or not?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Basically, somebody working on a slightly different product than me brought this up. Basically, when you rotate the CAs backing a Kubernetes cluster, it looks like the root, the CA root that we plumb into every pod for talking to Kube API server. That's not, it just read once at pod startup and then kind of held forever. At least that's what it looks like to me. So you have to bounce every pod in the cluster when you rotate the Kube API server serving root CA.
Really?
I only looked at the code.
That's a bug, not a feature.
I really thought that we had reload TLS files. Is this like the in cluster config and client go thing?
Yeah. So we make a cert util new pool with the file name. That reads it and makes a new pool from the bytes.
Oh. That.
I would be happy to see that fixed.
Oh, yeah. Wait,
Just
no.
that-
We if we can't load the file, we error. If we can load the file, we set a pointer to it in the client config. in the client config, we say .ca file. Here, let me talking about, oh yeah, there we go. So this is a check to make sure that the file that we're pointing at is a valid cert bundle. But what we actually propagate downward is a pointer to the file, not the content we loaded from it.
Oh, okay.
And so later, elsewhere, back on the ranch, like I'm pretty sure that if we are given pointers to handles, we load the content, but then we set reload TLS files true. And I thought we like set up the background. Was the issue you were seeing just based on inspection of code, or was someone actually observing like a rotation failing to load?
It's a secondhand observation of observing a failure to do this rotation. So I'm not sure in what depth they actually looked at it.
I'd be supportive of a test proving you can update this.
Oh.
If the test fails, I'd be happy to see it made reloadable.
It looks like the automatic, where we automatically set reload TLS files true, we are only doing that if you are given cert files and key files. We do not set that to true if you are given a CA file. So yeah, it looks like there's a bug, but it's a bug.
Okay.
And a test and a fix would be welcome.
Okay. Sounds good. I just wanted to check, like, is it something we need to discuss, or is it like, can we just do that? It sounds like we can just do that.
Just fix it.
Jordan, are you looking at specific files right now? Do you want to link it?
Yes, I am, and yes, I do.
Okay.
Cool. Thank you for bringing this up.
All right, next, inconsistent authorization of node resources.
Yeah, I put that in. So there's a when looking at like trying to get metrics add-ons like Prometheus running on clusters with some restrictions that prevent you from running exec on the nodes. I saw that there's this kind of difficult position that we put users in, that like there's two ways to get, say, node metrics on any Kubernetes cluster. The kind of the official or the most supported way would be via the API server, right? Like we don't recommend that you we allow direct access to the kubelet. So the problem with getting, say, nodes metrics from via the API server requires a very high level of privilege. It basically requires the proxy sub-resource on the basically that lets you like run arbitrary commands on any container running on that node. On the other hand, like there is some subdivision of the like the RBAC that kubelet will use to authorize requests, so that like you only need a subset of the permissions to, say, access metrics or stats. So we put users in this difficult position where like you need different permissions if you are connecting to the nodes directly, which we don't recommend. Or if you use the recommended path, which is via the API server proxy, then you require like a very high privilege, and you can't really take advantage of the RBAC sub-resource division that is that kubelet supports. So this is basically an explanation of that. And one I've kind of put in as examples or like initial thoughts about certain ways we could potentially fix that. One is to make the way kubelet creates maps the request path to the request attributes when performing a authorization request consistent across kubelet and API server. So kubelet would require just node/metrics. API server would require node/proxy. So one proposal is to make the authorization nodes in API server match what kubelet does. So you don't have to have direct access to the node, and you get to assign the least amount of privileges to any client that needs to access, say, node metrics. So my question is, like, what can we do? Is this a problem that is worth solving? And is this is letting add-ons and applications access the node endpoints directly kind of a supported path in the long term? Or are we taking the position that, like, if you are connecting to any node resource, any cluster resource, you should be going via the API server, no matter what. In which, if the latter is the position that we hold, then we should probably fix this inconsistency and allow users to assign least privilege to the workloads.
I'm not a fan of changing the RBAC contract, or actually, I guess this would even go to the all authorizer contract to set a path for resource requests. That's not a statement of, like, you know, the other problem that you observe one way or the other, but I don't think I have appetite for making that large a shift, because, like, what would happen if someone didn't honor it? You'd have to make sure that it failed safely everywhere.
Yeah, it's I kind of, that's why I kind of marked it as a hack. But I think the real solution is to is something that looks more like the reinterpret request, right? Like, but that also has problems in that to preserve backward compatibility, we would need to also allow proxy. Proxy should also match the metric sub-resource, right? So that any previous authorization to just allow proxy, which is what I think most clients would do, would also still work.
Does the node is resource request false there accurate? When the kubelet authorizes things, it authorizes them as a resource request.
Right. Kubelet does it correctly from the, or if you are connecting to kubelet directly, you don't have much of a problem, right? Except that we kind of explicitly say that direct node accessing the kubelet API endpoint is not permitted. It's kind of an API server bypass risk. You bypass all of the admission control and all of the the security controls, or all of the controls on the cluster are in the API server, and letting clients access kubelet directly kind of bypasses them, and we don't recommend that. And
I mean, not really. Like, it still gets, you still hit authorization, which is all you're going to get if you go to the API server for a read request, like a GET request. So the things that you can do against the kubelet API directly with fine-grained authorization, it's like read of logs, read of metrics, maybe read of pods. Like those read requests still hit authorization. The kubelet can still delegate authorization checks to the API server. You're never going to hit admission for read requests. I'm just trying to understand, like, what additional policy do we think we're gaining by going through the API server?
Are you trying to
I'm sorry, what?
I was gonna ask to be sure where the scraper he was running ran.
It could run outside the cluster, like,
And that's where it is. He can't
Yeah.
hit nodes because they're not exposed.
yeah, that's also a possible reason to look at solving this problem, right?
Yeah, what every time we talk about the kubelet API, we kind of skirt around the fact that the kubelet API is not really a thing that is super well defined, and we kind of say, oh, we don't really want people like using it, but then sometimes it's the only thing you can use. Has this prompted any discussion in Sig-Node about like defining that better or guaranteeing that or testing it? Or like, I'm hesitant to do special case things in the API server around an API surface that is sort of explicitly disclaimed.
Right. So to regard, even let's say we make improvements to the changes that you would need to it's like I'm trying to imagine the better kubelet API that would make this problem moot. And I'm thinking that would be something along the lines of where the metrics sub-resource is a resource that's actually known to the API server and interpreted, especially like in the today, like when you do a API v1 nodes node/proxy/metrics. /metrics is just a path. Like Kube API server doesn't really care what that is, right? So, but if there were a node API, then the path would look something more like node/node/say metrics API or something like that, and that would be that would then be proxy to kubelet. So is that the thing that you're
maybe like if we're actually saying this is an API surface that we want to support, rather than trying to just solve the authorization part of it and let people still go through this sort of unstructured catch-all proxy, hit a random endpoint on the kubelet middleman in the API server, and just authorize it specially. Like it seems like if logs and metrics and stats, if we're saying these are so fundamental and important, we need to support it, we need to do special things around them, like actually exposing them as real sub-resources seems like a more natural way to do it. I don't know if we want to say that about those APIs.
I thought so I might have misunderstood the stance just taken 3 months ago regarding node logs. Are you saying we should reassess that and say, you know what, these endpoints are special. We do know they have different behavior than proxy in general. We do know they can be authorized differently than proxy in general. And we do recognize that in some deployments, they are valuable to be recognized differently. I'm happy to do that, but that is different, right? I just want to make sure we don't send them off and then line them up for the same thing that happened in node logs.
I don't know. I wish.
Okay.
I wish
I will say, like, I am
that.
convinced that at least 3 of these that I recognize, logs, metrics, and stats, are different than general proxy. And that the people that I would give access to for logs and metrics and stats are different than the ones that I would give access to for proxy in general. And so I could definitely see a case that says these for nodes are special.
Metrics I can believe because that is produced by the kubelet and limited to the kubelet. Log, I think the questions about like what's the scope of the API and does this make a first class API that exceeds the scope of Kubernetes components. I mean, it's the same thing we talked about before. Stats, I could believe is scope to Kubernetes components, but I actually don't know the stability level of that. I think there's been a lot of work around like what stats show up there. And as we move from Docker Shim to Containerd and from CAdvisor to, I think some of those stats got deprecated. Like I just don't know the stability level of those things. And once we expose it as sort of a Kube API server facing API, I think what we guarantee about the content of that needs to be a lot clearer. So metrics and stats, I think there's a clearer path to, but I would have questions about like the content of those things. Logs, I think we run into the same question about, does this surface via API something that exceeds or goes outside of Kubernetes scope?
Do I understand correctly that you can authorize someone to access just a pod's logs, right? That is something that's possible through RBAC today.
Yes, but
right.
The sort of the rationale behind that being different than node logs is that the pod logs are completely owned, like they're limited to things managed by Kubernetes. What you can access via node logs is currently like any log on the system, and with the new alpha systemd Windows service support, it's like any log of any service running in the system.
Yeah, that looks like a kind of a time bomb, like because there are a lot of components which accidentally forget to scrub the logs of sensitive data, and yeah, it's.
So rather than focusing just on the authorization piece, I guess I would want to know, like, are these APIs we actually want to support? If so, let's define them and like say what the guarantees are, rather than just special casing the authorization bit.
Okay, so I think I should go talk to Sig-Auth and see what they think about this. Is that right?
I think more clarity can only help, even if, even for people who are currently using those endpoints directly against the kubelets. And I would try to do this, yeah, more holistically, and for that we need feedback from Sig-Auth on, especially the metrics and stats. Like, what's the stability of those? What's the long-term plans for those, if we wanted to promote those?
And there are other actions being added as well. Like this checkpoint is a new entrant, which unfortunately was not added as a new sub resource when it was. So you're still using proxy there.
Yeah, I think proxy is a decent, until better guarantees are made, having things live under proxy and require like super broad access and have a disclaimer on there that says this can't be part of conformance. Like, we don't, this API service isn't really guaranteed. We shouldn't promote things out of there until there is more clarity about what we're actually supporting there. Like, as soon as it becomes an API that you can call directly in the Kube API server, I think people have way higher expectations that that won't break.
Okay. So so the conclusion that kind of I draw from this discussion is that like the path is to define a stable API for these things so that they can become actual stable, fully grown resources, and then kind of the fact that we use proxy as a catch-all path goes away by itself, right?
That seems better to me. What do you think, David?
Yeah, I mean, stability, I don't actually know. I don't know today what I also don't know today what the shape of stats is. I thought metrics was fairly well set though. I thought metrics was, here are our Prometheus metrics, same format as everything else. And
Yeah.
that format was known. So unless we're gonna say unless the node team is gonna come back and say, we think we should reevaluate the shape of our server, that one looks pretty stable to me.
Oh, but one question I have is that, like, would this be a much bigger problem than let's defining like a kind of a metadata format that makes it suitable for a direct, like a full-fledged API surface? Would we need to define like the schemata of the stats, contents of the stats response itself, right? Would that be a prerequisite to making it, or could this be like a raw extension where it could be arbitrary JSON data under a field and some metadata that says that these are a node stats?
Those
I
are
think-
probably better questions for Sig Node. I
Mhm.
don't know that I would try to radically change the content of those endpoints. What I would care a lot more about is, like, if Signode adds sub-resources for these and someone integrates with them,
Mhm.
can they be confident that they won't get broken in the future?
And for that, I think practically you need to have some way to recognize your serialization version. And I don't know if the serialization version is known for stats. I don't know. For Prometheus, I think we have an expectation that it won't change. Though, to be honest, I guess we haven't defined it. And then for logs, I suspect we could actually find a way to constrain logs to do the 80% case safely, and not exceed scope. But I wouldn't block something like metrics on it. I just want to make sure it wasn't going to end up in the same category.
Sounds good. Thanks. I'll chat with the node, Sig-Node, and see what they think.
Sure.
Thanks.
Okay. I think that's it. That's all the stuff on the agenda. Is there anything else anybody wants to talk about? If not, we can end it. All right. Thank you all. Have a good one.
Thank you.